Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Family Office Sherpa podcast. I'm your host, Shaun Parkin, founder and managing director of Whole Road Investments. I'm based in sunny Perth in Australia. In this podcast, I'll be providing practical and implementable advice for those looking to build, manage, or service a family office. So let's get started.
This is the Family Office Sherpa.
In this episode, we are digging into family office human resourcing. Put simply, how do you staff and pay for the people that are working within the office? So what is the current state? I speak to a lot of family offices about staffing. Sometimes I play like a matchmaker in terms of getting staff and other more difficult to reach people and consultants to work in the family office space. It's not as easy as you think to get people to work within family offices. There are some challenges. So let's go through some of those. So starting with the models. So what sort of models are there? I've seen a heavily insourced model in terms of resourcing, which basically means a small number of people, sort of a core around sort of the chief investment officer, but sometimes not actually called that, sort of a head in investments, or basically the person responsible for that investments. And they also double up as the chief executive officer or the person that sort of engages with counterparties, things like that. And then you often have a finance component to it. You can call them the chief financial officer or the head of investment, head of finance. They also double hats with chief operating officer or the head of operations, the person that looks after the piping and the contracts and things like that. You do see a lot of differences between the first generation and sort of the more established versions, which tend to be, generation 3, 4. I'm not sure why that is. I mean, some people sort of point to the fact that the first generation tends to try and keep it as lean as possible. And also the first generation, you tend to have family office members that are still heavily involved with the operating and are very heavily involved in the investments too. They've just come out of potentially a liquidity event, or they're still within an operating business. So they'd still like to have their hand on the tiller. And so they're still very much involved. What are the methods that we've seen of retaining and retaining staff? So what are the methods of hiring? First up, post-liquidity event or in the embedded office, you've usually got the trusted employee from your operating business still there. I see a lot of single family offices which outside of the family members, maybe one or two people that came over from the operating business, they're either bringing over what we used to call anyway, the embedded office, which basically means that an operating business, a private operating business, often has a portfolio or an investment portfolio that sits within and is managed by the same staff that run the business. We call those embedded offices. They're either bringing that over to the single family office or they are starting a new one. The trend tends to be the focus first is investments, and then they tend to understand that investments, the cascade down from investments tends to be operational challenges, accounting challenges, finance challenges, compliance challenges, all those sorts of things. So that's when we tend to start to see people go, well, who do I need next? Usually they need someone to look after the admin, or there's some, components around that. But mostly outside of the investment side, they tend to go, well, we need finance in place, because up until recently, they were probably relying on the operating business staff to do a lot of that heavy lifting on the finance side. And also, we've talked about this in the past in those education podcasts, is that a lot of the operating componentry, is complex. It requires someone to look after on a day-to-day basis. It's not something that can be done, well, it can be done, but it probably can't be done well in a side of desk kind of approach. So what are we finding at the moment with staffing? And look, to be honest, like I mentioned, I am called upon to sort of try and assist family offices, particularly in Australia, look for staff. So what are they looking for? What's the current challenge in terms of getting that internal resource? To be honest, mid-level finance and investment staff are hard to find. When I say mid-level, I mean sort of, very 5 to 10 years experience, but have some career capital to bring over From the finance side, getting them out of sort of the career trajectory of the big four, the mid-tiers and things like that, or even, just specifically accounting and finance businesses is a challenge. And finding really good investment people that can go across multiple components that come within family offices. Investment staff at that mid-level, in terms of maybe single portfolio managers, but also really good research analysts and things like that have been tough, which kind of makes sense, I guess, where they are really more inclined to seek roles at that level of their career with potential career progression. And you're sort of getting up to that 10-year kind of point where you go, well, what do I want to do? Do I become a manager? Do I want to become a partner? Things like that. Do I want to manage outside money? So, it is a challenge. It's hard to get people, but, for the right type of role, I think it's quite an attractive proposition to some. Another challenge within this is that pay rates are quite uncertain, especially as they wear so many hats. And also the people hiring are not necessarily that aware of what finance and accounting staff should be paid as well, especially if they've sort of run an operating business that had different specialties, different, functions within there. And they probably never had to hire someone that works within the investment side. This is an investment business. So hiring people for investment business is very different to hiring people for a regular sort of operating business. And also they have to wear so many hats too. So if you're head of finance, but you're also head of operations, what does the pay rate look like? What does the compensation for time and like I mentioned, your career capital, what does that look like? Another challenge is sometimes the role requires skills outside their experience and training. I don't know about you, but I'm most of my happiness, or the way that I really like working, is if I know what I'm doing, or when I know what I'm doing, not if I know what I'm doing. And so a lot of people that are thrust into the family office sector come in there and go, now your role is to do this and this and this, where in previous roles you've been very specialized, being very siloed. So that uncertainty, if your skill sets are appropriate or your training is appropriate. And sometimes family offices are challenged by the fact that the onboard process, the ongoing training is not there and things like that. So you have to get people that are quite comfortable with uncertainty and comfortable and proactive enough to learn what they don't know, or to talk to people that they might learn from in this new role. One of the biggest sources of turnover, I find, is that anxiety, is that uncertainty, is that lack of direction, lack of training, an expectation to get things done when they potentially haven't been told how to do them. So I know, like I said, I know that's what keeps me up at night. So you don't want to be seen as doing anything less than competent. I think that's what most people do. They want to be seen to be doing the right job. So I think having some element of training and onboarding and improvement there, I think, is something that will remove some of those challenges for family offices. Like I said, I'm called on for assisting to find these people to work within the offices. I tend to be utilised by those looking for sort of more C-suite and potentially more established offices. If it's not an established office, I tend to sit within the investment or advisory committee anyway and do take on some of that heavy lifting. I think within the families that I help, one of the scopes of service that I provide is to take some of that capacity from internal people that might not have it. So that's kind of the point of having an external consultant, which is to say, do we have the skill set? Do we have the time? A lot of the time it's just time. But yeah, I getting the network effect to work to find those roles like CFO, CEO, CIO, all those things. So that's where I come around, and often they're not put up very often in terms of new roles. But the challenge for a lot of family offices is that it's sometimes they're a little bit secret squirrel, right? They're not telling people who they are and what they potentially, the attractiveness of the role. Big single family offices looking for a chief financial officer that can run across multiple disciplines and get their hands dirty in deals and things like that is quite attractive for a lot of people. But unless you let them know, then they're not going to find it. And also location. I live in Western Australia, which is a relatively small centre, but has its very big positives, and like any place, it has its challenges. But that smaller centre versus larger centre, New York and Sydney, very different. Sydney, Perth, different. So I think being very cognizant of the fact that you're going to be more challenged by certain centres or lifestyles and things like that. So I think family offices can really sort of help their cause to attract people by really digging into the benefits and making it a good place to work. So like I said, those challenges, finding those mid-level people, uncertainty of pay rates, skill sets and training, the C-suite and the fact that they come up so intermittently, and really being aware of your location and the positives of that location, I think making that clear as well. So into the nitty-gritty a little bit, pay rates. So a little bit of context. So pay rates for sort of incumbent staff or those staff that are brought over from the operating business or have been there longer tend to not get their pays reviewed quite as often as they should. Being in a corporate structure, you have that yearly review, and part of that yearly review tends to be focused around, are you content in the role? What's your career progression look like? But also, what is your pay rate? So I think pay rates are not often reviewed as much. You quite often find that family members are paid lower as well, but there is an element of, they are stewards for their own wealth a little bit. So there is a difference there. And often the longer you're there, the less inclined you are to have got your pay reviewed and things like that. But to be honest, I think that's the same for most corporates. Family offices are not known to be big spenders within this space. I mean, there are outliers for sure. And I know some outliers in terms of the fact that they will just say, to get the best people, we will pay the most. And it works incredibly well because they get incredibly good, very credentialed people within the office with that mentality. I don't think you need to go to the extremes on either side. I think finding the right people for the right role with the right compensation can be done. I just think that family offices tend to be a little bit more, especially sort of depending on the vintage of that family office. So newer family offices sometimes can be a little bit more bottom line centric, just like they do with every other aspect of running the office, and human resources is the same. So I think those that have built the wealth tend to be a bit more watchful of spending and watchful of wasteful spending. But again, you make the argument for hiring the right people and the right culture. But yeah, the vintage tends to dictate to a certain degree those that get paid more or less within this space. The larger offices tend to be a little bit more corporate-like in the structure. So you do have that a little bit more around, the ability to have pay rates reviewed and things like that. The bulk of the offices I deal with really are quite small or smaller. Well, the bulk of family offices generally are relatively small compared to sort of the like financial services businesses. Obviously, you're sort of sitting around that sort of 5 to 10 sort of people. So that tends to lean itself to a less corporate structure. Compensation types can vary as well. I think that's really important to understand within this space, because we do see a lot of really different ways of getting compensated outside of just a normal salaried role. You do salary plus bonus. You can do salary plus carry for some people, which means you get benefits of transactions and things like that you bring into the office. I think you have to be cautious a little bit around sort of on the investment side, what the incentive structure looks like in terms of making sure that the incentive is to run the assets for the family, not necessarily too biased towards incentives for financial gain from the investment staff themselves. But I think that can be managed. And I think, for some people, family offices is career limiting in terms of the fact that there's not that clear progression. So I think making compensation at least a bit more thoughtful, a little bit more imaginative outside of the box, and especially because of the types of investment that tends to come into the family office space as well, it can be very lucrative. Having an incentivized at the same time as for the benefit of the individual and for the benefit of the family. So I think getting that right can be very lucrative for both returns for the family and for income for the individual as well. But like I said, you just have to be a little bit mindful about the incentive structure being appropriate. So what are the pay rates? It's really hard to sort of pin them down, but KPMG put out a compensation report not that long ago, and I'll put it in the show notes for people that are interested. But for the US, let's use US dollars here. So the most common base salary for a US-based family office chief executive officer is around sort of $280,000 to $330,000, according to this report. But again, there are outliers, and it's difficult to sort of make that as a real case. But that we've got to start with somewhere, right? So, but the numbers can also top out to around US $1 million, according to that same report. Of the US firms surveyed, 13% were paying more than $1 million US. So it's a pretty good rate, right? And it's a really interesting big job, a CEO of a family, well, it can be, of a family office. So what don't these numbers show to a certain degree, right? So that's what are you getting compensated for here? So the challenge of uncertainty, very difficult to explain to potential employees, right? There is also the need to keep information out of the public domain, which again makes it hard to attract these people. For the employees themselves, like I said, there's limited progression. You will always be reporting into a family that sits at the top. You will never be the top of the family office, because that's the whole point of family offices, not to manage your wealth, but to manage, well, maybe you can manage your own wealth in your own family office. So personalities and the idiosyncratic nature of working for an individual can be a challenge for people. Change happens really quickly, and the process can be non-existent. So that is for someone that comes out of a senior executive role within a corporate structure which is very used to process and procedure and things like that, that can be a big challenge. It can happen that they come into the office one morning saying, everything that you've done, we're no longer doing, and we're doing this now. And process is whatever process that they determine as well. For a lot of people, they look at family offices and they think, well, the glamorous houses and boats and things like that, but it's potentially not as glamorous as that. I think there's, again, outliers in that space, but I think for a lot of people, it becomes a normal corporate job, right? And, you do see the trappings of wealth and things like that, but I think everyone has to remember that it's not their trappings of wealth, and they should be seen as assets that you need to manage as a good corporate citizen. So that's something that we do see it come out sometimes. One of the good things, and I think, as we go into these periods of uncertainty, is that they're not as reliant on commercial operations, the profitability of commercial operations, and therefore they're, less prone to these market cycles. So I've been made redundant several times. So for those that are not in Australia, redundancy basically means that you're not fired necessarily. Your job is no longer there because of market cycles and things like that. It's less inclined to happen within the family office space, especially the smaller ones, because ultimately the liquidity has been made. So you're an investment person, or you're an investment office now. So the selling of widgets or the commercial components of it is not necessarily as much of a driver. It's managing these assets appropriately during periods of uncertainty and down cycles and things like that. To be honest, you become more important as the cycle goes down, because you're the person that's acting on these cyclical changes. So I think it's really, really important to understand these sort of differences as well. So that's really what we're looking at today. So human resources within family offices. How hard is it to find people? It can be incredibly difficult. Once you find the right people, though, it's incredibly beneficial. If you're looking for the type of work that can be really diverse, really challenging, but really beneficial, but you also got to be get your head around the fact that things change very, very quickly. Probably not going to get the process and procedures you would like if you were that way inclined. For family offices listening to this, I would say to become a little bit less secret squirrel around the way that you're looking to attract people. It's difficult out there to find the right people. Use your network effect. Like I said, I can be useful for that as well, because I do obviously reach outside of the normal networks. But I think if both the family offices and the people potentially looking at working within family offices come together, think about it in a more imaginative way in terms of what should this person be paid, what's the net benefit, what's the environment, what's the culture, things like that. So hopefully this was helpful, and I look forward to talking to you again. Thanks. Bye.